Why do we celebrate Hanukkah? Traditionally, the Feast of Hanukkah has turned into a fun occasion in which we light 9 branches menorah, play dreidel, and give gifts to one another. But what are we really celebrating? How did it originate? And are we supposed to celebrate it? It is important to point out that Hanukkah is not one of the appointed times of Yehovah, which he commanded us in Leviticus 23 to celebrate. It rather originated about 1,000 years after the Torah was given on Mount Sinai. After the Jewish captives returned from Babylon, thanks to the Persian Empire conquering them, through the leadership of King Cyrus, who received a vision from Yehovah, he encouraged the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem and build the Holy Temple 70 years after it was destroyed. Almost 200 years later, Alexander the Great comes along, conquering right and left everything from Greece all the way to India, including, of course, the land of Israel. The first book of the Maccabees is a book that we do not have in our Jewish nor Christian Bibles, but it appears in the Catholic Bible and is widely accepted as per its validity. Now, why don't we have that book in our Bibles is something that I'm going to answer at the end of this video. The book of the Maccabees is an historical account narrated from the land of Israel, which tells us everything that happened from the conquest of Alexander all the way through the division of his empire, the evil Antiochus Epiphanes king, which wanted to Hellenize the Jews, the Maccabean revolts, and the rededication of the temple. The reason why we celebrate Hanukkah is clearly outlined in this book. So if you want to celebrate Hanukkah, you might as well read it. The Jewish people were divided. On one hand, you had the people that followed the ancient path, that had zeal for the law of God and wanted to keep His commandments. And by the other hand, you have the assimilated Jews, the people that were assimilated to the Greek culture of globalization, external beauty, and intellectual knowledge. Any similarity with the current Greco-Roman culture is pure coincidence. Quote, "In those days went there out of Israel wicked men who persuaded many, saying, 'Let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us, for since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow.' So this device pleased them well. Then certain people were so forward herein that they went to the king, who gave them license to do after the ordinances of the heathen. Whereupon they built a place of exercise, a gymnasium, at Jerusalem according to the customs of the heathen, and made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief." Now, a gymnasium, coming from Greek culture, was a place where the Greeks went to exercise, and they would exercise naked, nude. So, when the assimilated Jewish people would go to try to be Greeks, and the Greeks would see them and see that they are naked, and they will see that they are circumcised, so that they are not Greeks. So they will be, of course, discriminated. They would be less, because of course they are missing a part of their perfect body. The foreskin is missing. So the assimilated Jews, what they try to do is go through a very painful surgical procedure to return a foreskin to the penis, so that they would not look uncircumcised and be able to blend in with the Greeks when they would go to the gymnasium. The book of the Maccabees is very, very dynamic and very exciting. It outlines how the arrogant king Antiochus Epiphanes came against Jerusalem and desecrated the temple. Quote, this is all in chapter 1. And after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned again in the 143rd year and went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude, and entered proudly into the sanctuary, and took away the golden altar and the candlestick of light, the menorah, and all the vessels thereof, and the table of showbread, and the pouring vessels, and the vials, and the censers of gold, and the veil, and the crown, and the golden ornaments that were before the temple, all which he pulled off. He took also the silver and the gold and the precious vessels and all the hidden treasures which he found. And when he had taken all away, he went into his own land, having made a great massacre, and spoke very proudly. Therefore there was a great mourning in Israel, in every place where they were. 2 years later, Antiochus Epiphanes comes again against Jerusalem, this time causing a real big mess. Now, quote again. We are still in chapter 1. Moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people. New World Order, anyone? 142. And everyone should leave his laws, so all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Many also of the Israelites consented to his religion and sacrificed unto idols and profaned the Sabbath. For the king had sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbaths and feast days, and pollute the sanctuary and holy place, set up altars and groves and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts, that they should also leave their children uncircumcised, and make their souls abominable with all manners of uncleanness and profanation, to the end they might forget the law and change all the ordinances, and whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said he should die. Now, this is what Hellenized culture means. This is what Hellenization means. Is what you do, you don't have to kill everybody, you just have to help them to lose their identity. If a nation loses their identity, then they just submit to the law that you are imposing, because a nation is strong only as long as they have their own identity. So the Hellenistic Greeks, what they did is you just get them to lose their identity, and that's the way we conquer. That was extremely smart. Now, just a quick note. All these laws that were decreed by Antiochus were stunningly similar to those decreed 600 years later by the Roman Emperor Constantine, which caused the true believers in Yeshua to evolve into modern Christianity as we know it today, which is a mixture between biblical principles and pagan Roman religion. Now, imagine you as a Christian telling the Jews that now that there is a new covenant, now after Yeshua, they do not need to eat clean food, they do not need to circumcise themselves or their children, nor keep anything that is commanded in the law. For them, you are just as the evil king Antiochus, preventing them to keep the holy covenant that was commanded for all generations. Now, back to the book of Maccabees. Quote, Now the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar, and built idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. Now, the writer of this book sees what happened here as a certain fulfillment of the prophecy of the book of Daniel, and in my opinion is also one layer of fulfillment of that prophecy that will also have a second layer of fulfillment at the beginning of the Great Tribulation. And whosoever was found with any book of the law or in any committed to the law, the king's commandment was that they should put him to death. Thus did they by their authority unto the Israelites every month, to as many as were found in the cities. Now, the 25th day of the month, they sacrifice upon the altar of God, at which time, according to the commandment, they put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised, and they hung the infants about their necks, and rifled their houses, and slew them that had circumcised them. Howbeit many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat any unclean thing. Wherefore they rather die, that they might not be defiled with meats, and that they might not profane the holy covenants. So then they died. At that time there was a man called Mattathiah, and he had 5 sons. They all lived in Modi'in, that is a town located in between Jerusalem and modern-day Tel Aviv. They were from the line of Levi. He was a son of a priest, so they were very zealous for the law. When they heard all these abominations that were taking place, they rented their garments, they were in deep sorrow, and they wanted to die before seeing all these abominations. In this moment, the Greeks were going from town to town, forcing people to worship before their idols, and they would take the most important people on each town in order to set an example for the rest of the population that they should comply with the laws of the king. So they came into the town of Modi'in at the time that Mattathiah and his sons were mourning and were so sad and so upset about what was going on. So what happened? Quote, the king's officer said, "Now you come first, Mattathiah, and fulfill the king's commandment, like as all the heathen have done, and the men of Judah also, and such as remain at Jerusalem, you and your house, let you be in the number of the king's friends, and you and your children shall be honored with silver and gold and many rewards." Then Mattathiah answered and spoke with a loud voice, "Though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him, and fall away everyone from the religion of their fathers and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons and my brethren walk in the covenant of our fathers. God forbid that we should forsake the law and the ordinances. We will not hearken to the king's words to go from our religion either to the right or to the left." Now, when he had finished speaking these words, there came one of the Jews in the sight of all to sacrifice on the altar, which was at Modi'in, that was the pagan altar, according to the king's commandment. That thing, when Mattathiah saw, he was inflamed with zeal, and his reins trembled, neither could he forbear to show his anger according to judgment. Wherefore he ran and slew him upon the altar. Also the king's commissioner, who compelled men to sacrifice, he killed at that time, and the altar he pulled down. Thus dealt he zealously for the law of God, like Phinehas did unto Zimri the son of Salam. Do you remember Phinehas in the desert, in the wilderness? He did the same thing when they were practicing a pagan worship. And Mattathiah cried throughout the city with a loud voice, saying, "Whosoever is zealous of the law and maintains the covenant, let him follow me." So he and his sons fled into the mountains and left all that ever they had in the city. Then many that sought after justice and judgment went down into the wilderness to dwell there. They began to uprise against all the decrees of the king, so much so that they were even taking children that were not circumcised because the parents were afraid of the king's orders, and they would forcefully circumcise those children. Soon, Mattathias' time to die approached, so he gathered all his children, his 5 sons, and he spoke with them very encouraging words in order for them to continue this uprising. And he ordained in command his bravest son, that was Judah, that later he was nicknamed Maccabee. That Maccabee means in Aramaic hammer. So Judah Maccabee was a very courageous man, and he had a strong faith. He fought a number of battles, even against armies that outnumbered his army by thousands. And he was never afraid, but rather he would encourage his warriors, telling them that it's not about the number of warriors, but rather about the Lord. The battle belongs to the Lord, and if we have faith in Him, He is going to grant us the victory. It doesn't matter how many they are. Do not fear, and charge against them every time. After a certain battle, he got the Greeks to withdraw from Jerusalem. So they went back to Jerusalem, and they found the Holy Temple laid waste. And this is what happened. This is after 5 years. They had no presence in Jerusalem. They go back to Jerusalem. Quote, "Then said Judas and his brethren, let's go up and cleanse and dedicate the sanctuary." And here is where the origin of Hanukkah comes from. Upon this, all the host assembled themselves together and went up to Mount Zion. And when they saw the sanctuary desolate, and the altar profane, and the gates burned up, and shrubs growing in the courts as in a forest, or in one of the mountains, and the priest's chambers pulled down, they rent their clothes, and made great lamentation, and cast ashes upon their heads, and fell down flat to the ground upon their faces, and blew an alarm with the trumpets, and cried toward heaven. Then Judas appointed certain men to fight against those that were in the fortress until he had cleansed the sanctuary. So he chose priests of blameless conversation, such as had pleasure in the law, who cleansed the sanctuary and bare out the defiled stones into an unclean place. And as they consulted what to do with the altar of burnt offerings, which was profane, they thought it's best to pull it down, lest it should be a reproach to them, because the heathen had defiled it. Wherefore they pulled it down, and laid up the stones in the mountain of the temple in a convenient place, until there should come a prophet to show what to do with them. Then they took whole stones according to the law, and built a new altar according to the former, and made up the sanctuary and the things that were within the temple, and hallowed the courts. They made also new holy vessels, and into the temple they brought the candlestick, the menorah, and the altar of burnt offerings and of incense, and the table. And upon the altar they burnt incense, and the lamps that were upon the candlestick they lit, that they might give light in the temple. Furthermore, they set the loaves upon the table, and spread out the veils, and finished all the works which they had begun to make. Now, on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is called the month of Kislev, in the 148th year, they rose up in the morning and offered sacrifice according to the law upon the new altar of burnt offerings which they had made. Look at what time and what day the heathen had profaned it, even in that was it dedicated with songs and lutes and harps and cymbals. So the same day that the temple was desecrated, but 5 years later, in the very same day, is that they rededicated the temple. And here is where Hanukkah comes from. Then all the people fell upon their faces, worshipping and praising the God of heaven, who had given them good success. And so they kept the dedication, Hanukkah, of the altar 8 days, and offered burnt offering with gladness, and sacrificed the sacrifice of deliverance and praise. They decked also the forefront of the temple with crowns of gold, and with shields, and the gates and the chambers, and they renewed and hung doors upon them. Thus was there very great gladness among the people, for that the reproach of the heathen was put away. Moreover, Judas and his brethren, with the whole congregation of Israel, ordained that the days of the dedication of the altar should be kept in the season from year to year by the space of 8 days, from the 25th day of the month of Kislev, with mirth and gladness. So, all this happens in the first 4 chapters of the book of Maccabees. And the rest of the book, it tells what happens from then on. It's a number of battles, is going into detail extensively, and what happens after the death of Judah Maccabee, and it goes on. It's a history book. Now, in the first 4 chapters, it's telling you what the origin of Hanukkah is about. Did you know that the miracle of the oil in the menorah lasting for 8 days does not appear at all in the book of Maccabees? It appears only centuries later in the Talmudic record. Only in the Talmud is that this miracle appears. If the Maccabees, when they rededicated the temple and the altar, they were lighting a 7 branches menorah, as we are commanded to have in the temple. Why is every Jew in the world lighting now a 9 branches menorah? Why did the focus change so much from rebellion to a miracle of oil? I am convinced the reason is the same reason why we don't have the book of the Maccabees in the canon of the Bible today. When the canon of the Bible was being arranged at the time of Rabbi Akiva, the Romans had control over Israel. Now, the Jewish leadership at the time had close ties with the Roman rulers at the time. Now, if you have a whole nation celebrating rebellion against their rulers, rebellion against their pagan authorities, year after year, do you think that the rulers are going to be happy? Do you think that maybe it would incite the oppressed to rise again against their rulers? I think so. So, I think that the Jewish leadership at the time chose to turn the focus of the rebellion, from the rebellion to a miracle, and kind of blur away the real reason and motive of the feast. So the book of Maccabees was suppressed and replaced with a lukewarm and half-meaningful tradition. Now, a frequently asked question: should we celebrate Hanukkah? It is very important to emphasize that the only one that commanded us to celebrate Hanukkah was Judah Maccabee. And I do not believe that we should follow any commandment of men, but only what Jehovah commands us. With that being said, if we do not take it as a commandment, but we want to rejoice remembering the defeat of the pagan oppressor and the restoration of our freedom of worship, I don't see anything wrong with that. So I wish you a happy Hanukkah. Shalom.